In a previous video, I converted these RX 470 mining graphics cards into gaming cards. We added some resistors and capacitors to make this inactive HDMI port work, and then we flashed the gaming BIOS. However, I still find that these graphics cards are not quite usable yet. Like, who wants to just use one monitor when you could use like 2 or 3 or maybe even 6? Okay, maybe not 6. But we can get up to 4 extra ports on this GPU for a total of 5 monitors. And all it takes is to solder these video ports into their corresponding places. And about a million other small parts, but we'll talk about that later. Definitely easier said than done. Why is that shorting to ground? What the hell? Oh my god. Okay, so I have my mining GPU here from the previous video. And I also have this HDMI port which I'm going to attempt to solder on. This is actually a PS3 HDMI port, but it looks like it should fit. I mean, it looks pretty much exactly the same as this one. So yeah, it's probably easier said than done, to be honest, because there's actually a lot of components that are missing from this board inside here, not just the HDMI port. So just soldering this on won't work. You actually have to include all the components that they didn't include on this board to begin with. But let's give it a try. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to test this card to make sure it still actually works. Like, you wouldn't want to do all this soldering and then find out it doesn't even work in the first place. Okay, still works. That's good. It means we haven't broken anything from last time. Everything is working correctly with our one HDMI port that we got working in the previous video. Disassembling the card is very straightforward. We just have these 10 screws on the back, which hold the heatsink and the case onto the card. Once we've done that, we can now see the area where our HDMI port will go. Okay, so in order to do this, we're going to have to put this on, which means we're going to have to make holes where each of these holes are. Now this seems relatively easy, but actually it isn't, unless you've got the correct tools, of course. A soldering iron can't melt through the solder, even when putting a lower melting point solder on top, so I opted to drill the holes. But these holes are really tiny, and you will need micro drill bits of size 0.4mm to 0.6mm for the HDMI holes. So here I'm using these drill bits, but maybe don't use these drill bits because they really suck. And I mean like really suck. They constantly break, but that's not even the worst part. It's when these drill bits get stuck inside the card, they get properly stuck, and you can't remove them. What the f? And then if you snap it off, it will leave a piece of drill bit inside, which becomes literally impossible to drill through. And if you're not careful and you drill through that, you will damage the hole to a point where the contact is no longer even usable. You could of course use a slightly thicker drill bit like 0.6mm, so it's less likely to break off, but then you have more chance of just completely drilling the whole contact away from the hole. Anyway, so after a lot of drilling and swearing later, we now finally have all the holes open and we can now get the HDMI port through. Funnily enough, drilling the holes is actually probably the hardest part of this. Now we can move on to the easier parts. But we just need to do a little bit more drilling first. Luckily these holes are large, so you can use a 1mm drill bit, and that's unlikely to break. And now we have 2 holes here and here for the HDMI port legs. And all we need to do now is put the HDMI port in, making sure to carefully align up the pins with the holes. Give it a good push, and the HDMI port is in. To make sure we have a good connection, we need to add solder to the other side. And we're just going to coat each pin in a good amount of solder, being very careful not to short any pins to each other. Unfortunately, we're not done here, because to keep costs low on this mining card, a lot of components are missing which are required for the HDMI port to work. That means we need to put them back on if we want to get a video signal. So let's start with the HDMI transistor, which is the MMBT3904LT1G. There are of course other transistors that could work here, but this one worked for me, so I know this one works. So I'm going to remove the excess solder with a desoldering wick, so the components lay flat when we put them on. And then I'm going to solder on the transistor onto this part which is marked Q4605. And directly under that, in the spots marked R5024 and R5025, we need to put 10 kilo ohm resistors of power 0.0625 watts and of size 0402 or 1005 in metric. Then we have the MOSFET SSM6N7002 CFU, and that goes into Q4603. And then we have another two 10 kilo ohm resistors in spaces R5010 and R5007. Directly below the MOSFET, we have two lots of 2.15 kilo ohm resistors, and these are of the same size and power as all the other resistors. And directly below that, placed vertically, we have 33 ohm resistors, also of the same power and size. Now all we need to do is add the exact same components to this square as we did in the previous video, where we got the first HDMI port working. Clean it up with some alcohol, and that will be it for the second HDMI port. Let's pull it back together and test it out. And when we plug it in, it doesn't work. The graphics card itself isn't actually broken, but this HDMI port isn't working unfortunately. And by doing a bit of digging, we can see that this HDMI pin shorts to ground when it most definitely shouldn't. So it seems like there is actually a problem with this graphics card after we put the HDMI port in. So using a multimeter on the HDMI port that was already there, we can see that this pin number 2 here doesn't go to ground. So that shouldn't be going to ground. And none of these top pins here go to ground. But on the one that I put in, I've removed some of the solder just to make it easier to see. But if we go to this pin number 2 and go to ground, it shorts to ground. So that's definitely not right. So I think with this one I've probably messed up the hole here, and this is now shorting to ground, which means that it probably can't really be used anymore for this HDMI port. This HDMI port still works though. You can actually follow the traces on the card to see which pin is supposed to be connected to where. So it's very important you drill these holes carefully to have something not like this happen. Luckily, I have another card which I also soldered the HDMI port onto, and this one works. As you can see, we have the HDMI port connected, and moving it to the other port, we still have a video signal, so at least one of the other cards works, I guess. Now we got the display ports, which are even harder because the holes are even smaller. We have to use a 0.4mm drill bit, which easily breaks. So after trying for a bit, and getting about 5 drill bits stuck, I decided to get one of these. So this is a desoldering gun, and it makes removing the solder in the holes about 100 times easier. So now all we got to do is put on some fresh solder, heat it up, and suck it up. And now you can see we got all the holes open for our DisplayPort to go in. Before we put the DisplayPort on, we need to attach some components, and this will just make it easier for us, as the access to these components will get really tight once we put on the port. So I'm going to heat tape off the holes to make sure not to accidentally get any solder on them. And then we can remove the excess solder before adding 8 0.1 microfarad 16 volt 10% capacitors with size 0402 or 1005 in metric. After that, we will add a 1 mega ohm resistor of the same size and power to the top. And then we just do the exact same thing for the DisplayPort at the top. Now, for the top DisplayPort, we need to add the SSM6N7002 CFU MOSFET. And that's exactly the same one we used in the HDMI. And then directly next to that in R1803 and R1802, we need to add two 100 kilo ohm resistors. Directly to the right of the MOSFET, we need to add two 0.1 microfarad capacitors, the same ones which we added 8 of next to the display ports. Directly next to these capacitors, we need to add two 3.3 ohm resistors, stacked above each other like so. We then need a 10 kilo ohm resistor in the spot marked R1805, before putting the MOSFET 2N7002K into the spot next to the resistor marked Q1804. We then need to add a 10 microfarad capacitor of size 0603 or 1608 in metric, so this is a bigger size capacitor. Then we do pretty much the exact same thing to the bottom display port, except here we need two SSM 6N 7002 CFUs, one on the left and one on the right. At this part marked F1800 at the top of the card, you need a reset fuse. And now we need to go to the back of the card where we have more components to solder on. So right next to the display ports, in the transistor parts, we need two HN1C01FU-GR transistors. And then in the spots marked R1806 and R1906, we need two 4.7 mega ohm resistors of size 0402 or 1005 in metric. And then finally, the 7 remaining spaces are filled with 10 kilo ohm resistors of the same size. Now we can put our display ports on and solder all the pins. Okay, so now let's test out the ports. And sure enough, the first one's working, and when we switch to the second port, it's also working. Okay, so that's good. So let's move on to the DVI port. For the DVI port, we need to clear the holes in this area. Luckily, these holes are a lot bigger, so you can easily drill them, or you can use a desoldering gun. Once you've done that, it'll look a bit like this, and now we go to the reverse of the card to put on a few components. First, we need to add 14 0.1 microfarad capacitors, which we have used many times before, and those capacitors go on all of these parts marked with the C at the beginning. And right next to those capacitors, we have 14 pieces of 499 ohm resistors, in all the spaces marked with an R. Below this part, we then have two 10 kilo ohm resistors in R1941 and R1940, followed by a SSM 6N 7002 CFU MOSFET that we used before in Q1980. After this, R1985 and R1986 both require a 2.2 kilo ohm resistor, and between those we have R1990 and R1991, which both need a 10 ohm resistor each. And now that's the back finished. Now on the front, also by the DVI port connector, you need to solder an MMBT3904LT1G, as well as two 10 kilo ohm resistors. Somehow I managed to lose this footage though. Normally you would use a wire or a ribbon cable type connector to connect the DVI contacts to the port. But in my case, I don't really use DVI or have the need for a DVI port, so I'm just going to solder the port directly to the board, just to check it works. And after soldering all the pins, it looks so weird because the DVI port is directly on the board instead of the I/O. Also, there's no actual way of connecting this with the heatsink on, so it's definitely just for testing purposes. So let's connect the DVI port, and now when we test it, it should work. I'm going to do this quickly and just boot into the BIOS to check it works, because I can't put the heatsink on at the same time, so it'll probably overheat. Make sure to connect the PCIe connector as well, which I forgot, and I was getting worried that it wasn't actually working. And now we can see it's working, but it quickly overheated. So now we at least know that the DVI port works. And now we can use multi-monitors with our mining card. Like here, I'm using two monitors in extended mode, and I can even get 1440p or 4K on the monitor. So that's all well and good, but is it even worth it? So an RX 470 mining GPU costs around $25, and the cost of each DisplayPort was around $2 including shipping. So that's two of them for $4. Then the DVI port and HDMI port were about $1.50 each, so that's $7 in total on ports. The cost of the resistors, MOSFETs, transistors and capacitors is pretty low. Most are under 1 cent. So what I'm going to say now is that these are going to be estimates, so take it with a pinch of salt. The first HDMI components cost around 30 cents for about 32 resistors and capacitors. The second HDMI cost around 60 cents in components. The two display ports cost around $1.50 in components, and the DVI components are also around 60 cents. So this takes our total components cost to about $3. This gives us a total cost of about $35 for this card, which is not too bad. It's still cheaper than the normal 478GB, which costs around $45 to $60, I think. However, there is another thing to consider, which is the equipment and quantity of how many parts you order. If you include the equipment, then it's definitely not worth it. And similarly, if you only order a few components, you will have to pay a higher price and possibly have to pay for shipping. So it really just depends on what stuff you already have and how many cards you're going to solder the ports onto to see if it's even worth doing. Thanks for watching.